Imagine if one of the oldest civilizations in human history never completely disappeared. Imagine if the people who built the first great cities of southern Mesopotamia did not vanish when their temples collapsed, their kings were forgotten, and their language fell silent. Imagine if a fragment of their biological history survived, not inside a museum, not on a clay tablet, but inside the DNA of people living among the same rivers today. For decades, historians have asked what happened to the Sumerians. Archaeologists uncovered their cities. Linguists reconstructed their strange and fascinating language. Scholars translated their clay tablets. But one question remained almost impossible to answer: where did the Sumerian people themselves go? And now genetics has opened a door into that mystery. There is a viral claim about a 1 in a billion Sumerian bloodline that scientists supposedly cannot explain. The exact 1 in a billion statistic (EC) is not established science. But behind that sensational headline is a real genetic discovery that is far more interesting than the internet version. Researchers studying the Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq found a predominantly Middle Eastern genetic background and identified a paternal Y chromosome lineage called J1 page 08 that showed evidence of a local expansion estimated to be roughly 4,000 years ago, remarkably overlapping the era when Sumerian city-states such as Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, and Larsa were flourishing. But does that mean the Marsh Arabs are the surviving Sumerians? No scientist can honestly make that simple claim from this evidence alone. And yet the genetic pattern creates a question that is much harder to dismiss. How much of the ancient population of southern Mesopotamia survived through thousands of years of conquest, migration, cultural change, and political collapse? To understand why this matters, we have to travel back to a world that existed before the great empires of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, before classical Greece dominated the imagination of historians, and before Rome became a superpower. We have to travel to southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where one of humanity's most extraordinary experiments was taking place. Here the landscape was difficult but extraordinarily productive. Rivers carried water through an otherwise dry environment. Seasonal flooding deposited fertile sediment. Humans learned to control water through canals and irrigation. Small settlements became larger communities. Communities became cities. And eventually, cities became something humanity had never created at this scale before: complex urban civilization. This was the world of Sumer. Uruk became enormous by ancient standards. Ur became a center of political and religious power. Eridu developed into one of the earliest major settlements of southern Mesopotamia. Lagash became a powerful city-state. Temples accumulated wealth. Administrators needed records. Merchants needed contracts. Governments needed to track grain, labor, livestock, and taxes. And out of this administrative complexity came one of humanity's most revolutionary technologies: writing. Sumerian cuneiform allowed people to place information onto clay and preserve it for generations. This is why we know so much about Sumerian civilization compared with many other prehistoric societies. The Sumerians left behind contracts, lists, prayers, myths, economic records, royal inscriptions, and stories. But here is the strange part. The tablets tell us what people wrote, not exactly what happened to their descendants. We can reconstruct kings. We can reconstruct cities. We can reconstruct wars. But the genetic identity of the people who lived in those cities remains much harder to trace. And that is because a civilization is not the same thing as a gene pool. Political identities can disappear while populations survive. Languages can disappear while descendants remain. Religions can change. Empires can conquer territories without replacing every person living there. A city can fall while farmers, fishermen, and families continue living nearby. This is the fundamental problem in the Sumerian mystery. When people say the Sumerians disappeared, what exactly does disappeared mean? Did every Sumerian leave southern Mesopotamia? Did they die out? Were they absorbed into other populations? Did their language disappear while their descendants remained? Or did several of these things happen at the same time? Genetic research gives us a way to approach these questions, but it does not give us a magical answer. DNA is not a label maker. It does not contain a tiny message saying, Sumerian. Instead, scientists look at patterns. They compare populations. They study mutations. They examine paternal and maternal lineages. They estimate when particular branches expanded, and when enough evidence lines up, they can make cautious inferences about population history. One of the most important tools in the Marsh Arabs study was the Y chromosome. Why? Because the Y chromosome is passed from father to son. That means particular paternal lineages can remain recognizable across many generations. Imagine a man living thousands of years ago. He has sons. Those sons have sons. Their sons continue the line. Over centuries, mutations accumulate in the Y chromosome. Most of the branches of that family eventually disappear, but one branch may survive and expand. Thousands of years later, researchers can identify that branch in living men and estimate when it became common. It is not a complete picture of ancestry. It represents only one paternal line. But sometimes one line can reveal an extraordinary demographic event. In the 2011 study of Marsh Arabs, the Marsh Arab gene pool was predominantly Middle Eastern, with weaker Southwest Asian and African contributions. More than 90% of the Y chromosome gene pool in the study could be traced to Western Eurasian components, with Middle Eastern haplogroups playing a major role. The study found that haplogroup J was especially common among Marsh Arabs, and most of those J chromosomes belonged to the J1M267 branch, particularly J1 page 08. And then came the detail that made the story so fascinating. Researchers estimated that the J1 page 08 branch had undergone a local expansion around 4,000 years ago. The authors explicitly noted that the estimated age overlaps with the period of Sumerian city-state development in southern Mesopotamia. Now stop for a moment and think about that. We are not talking about southern Mesopotamia was producing the cities we now associate with Sumer. That does not prove that the lineage was Sumerian, but it provides a fascinating population genetic clue. It suggests that something happened to a local male population around the same broad era. A lineage expanded, its descendants survived, and today a significant signal from that lineage exists among people living in the same geographical region. Could this be coincidence? Absolutely. Could it reflect demographic processes connected to the rise of Sumerian society? Possibly. Could it be direct proof that modern Marsh Arabs are Sumerians? No. That final leap goes beyond the evidence. But this is exactly where the mystery becomes more interesting, because perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, are Marsh Arabs Sumerians? Perhaps we should ask, did the population living in southern Mesopotamia during the rise of Sumer contribute genetically to populations living there today? That is a question genetics can investigate more realistically, and the answer from the available study is suggestive of local continuity, but not definitive proof of direct Sumerian descent. The researchers themselves described the Sumerian origin question as unresolved. This distinction matters because the ancient world was never genetically frozen. Southern Mesopotamia was a crossroads. People moved through it from northern Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, the Levant, and other surrounding regions. Trade routes connected distant communities. Political expansion moved soldiers and administrators. Families migrated. Marriage connected. Populations. New languages appeared. old languages disappeared. So even if modern Marsh Arabs preserve ancestry from ancient southern Mesopotamians, that ancestry would not necessarily be pure Sumerian. There was probably never a single pure Sumerian genetic type to begin with. The people living in southern Mesopotamia before and during the rise of Sumer were themselves descendants of earlier populations. Human history is not a sequence of perfectly separated boxes. It is a network. One population mixes with another. A new cultural identity forms. A language spreads. A political state emerges. And hundreds of years later, the descendants of those people may identify very differently. This is why the disappearance of the Sumerian language does not necessarily mean the disappearance of every person who spoke it. Languages can die while populations survive. Consider what happens when an empire conquers a region. Institutions may change, administrative systems may change, but local communities can continue. Their children grow up speaking a new language while inheriting ancestry from older populations. Over enough generations, the cultural identity can be completely transformed while some biological continuity remains. This may be part of what happened in Mesopotamia. Sumerian eventually ceased to be a spoken community language, but the people of southern Mesopotamia did not simply vanish from the landscape. They became part of later populations. Akkadian-speaking cultures rose. Babylonian civilization developed. Assyria became a major power. Persian empires controlled the region. Hellenistic rulers arrived. Later came Arabization and Islamic transformation. Each era reshaped southern Iraq, but each did not necessarily replace the entire population. This is why the Marsh Arab evidence matters. The marshes are not simply a random modern population thousands of miles from ancient Sumer. They occupied the same broad southern Mesopotamian environment where ancient city-states flourished. Their traditional lifestyle also preserves features that researchers have compared with ancient marsh life, including reed architecture, fishing, water buffalo husbandry, rice cultivation, and distinctive boats. The 2011 study noted these cultural parallels, while also emphasizing that cultural continuity alone cannot prove genetic continuity. Culture can survive through imitation. It can spread between populations. People can adopt practices from neighbors, so archaeology and genetics have to be combined. One tells us about material and cultural continuity. The other tells us about biological relationships. When the two lines of evidence point in similar directions, the historical case becomes more interesting. But there is another twist in the DNA evidence. The study found weaker Southwest Asian and African contributions, particularly in mitochondrial DNA, showing that the Marsh Arab population was not completely isolated. This is important because it destroys another popular misconception, that ancient continuity requires genetic purity. It does not. A population can preserve substantial local ancestry while also receiving genetic contributions from outsiders. In fact, that is what we should expect after thousands of years. Imagine a river. Its main current can remain recognizable while hundreds of smaller streams flow into it. The water at the end is not identical to the water at the beginning, but there is still continuity. Human populations work similarly. A modern population can carry layers of ancestry from different historical periods. Some layers may be thousands of years old, others may be much more recent. Some paternal lineages can expand dramatically, while maternal lineages tell a different story. Social customs can also influence these patterns. The researchers found greater male than female genetic homogeneity among Marsh Arabs and suggested that social factors such as patriarchality, polygamy, and unequal migration rates may have contributed. In simple language, the way people formed families and moved between communities could affect which genetic lines became common. This is another reason why a bloodline is not a mystical concept. Demography can create surprisingly strong genetic signatures. Suppose a relatively small community has 10 paternal lineages. If one lineage produces many more surviving sons than the others, that lineage can become dominant after several generations. If the population then expands, thousands of descendants may carry the same paternal branch. To an observer thousands of years later, it could look like a mysterious ancient bloodline. But the mechanism may be ordinary population growth amplified over time. That does not make the result boring. It makes it scientifically understandable. And the same principle could help explain why particular genetic lineages become associated with ancient populations. Now, think about the phrase, 1 in a billion. It sounds incredibly precise. It sounds scientific. But precision is not the same as evidence. There is no verified study establishing a 1 in a billion probability for a Sumerian bloodline. So if you see that number in a viral title, treat it as a storytelling device, not a measured genetic statistic. The real evidence is stronger when we do not exaggerate it. Scientists did not discover a magical chromosome that says Sumerian. They found a genetic pattern that may preserve evidence of local demographic history overlapping with the Sumerian period. That is enough to create a powerful documentary without inventing statistics. And there is an even deeper question. Who exactly were the Sumerians genetically? For a long time, scholars have debated whether the Sumerians arrived from somewhere else or developed largely from populations already living in Mesopotamia. The 2011 Marsh Arabs study does not solve the entire problem, but its findings argue against the idea that the modern Marsh population is primarily descended from a large South Asian. That is an important result, because the marshlands have sometimes been used as evidence for a South Asian origin story. Water buffalo and rice have connections to South Asia, but cultural and agricultural diffusion does not automatically mean mass population replacement. Crops move, animals move, technologies move, people move, but these movements do not always happen at the same scale. A farming technique can travel between communities without millions of farmers relocating. An animal can be introduced through trade. A new crop can be adopted by existing populations. Genetics can sometimes distinguish these scenarios. In the Marsh Arab case, the genetic evidence suggested that the local Middle Eastern population remained the dominant biological component. But there is another problem we have to confront: the sample size. 143 individuals is valuable, especially for a focused population study. But it is not the same as sequencing thousands of people across 5,000 years. And uniparental markers such as Y chromosome and mtDNA provide only narrow windows into ancestry. They are powerful for tracing particular paternal and maternal lines, but they cannot reconstruct the entire genome of an ancient civilization. This is why modern population genetics increasingly relies on genome-wide ancient DNA when preservation allows it. The field has grown dramatically. A 2024 scientific data paper describing the Allen Ancient DNA Resource noted that more than 10,000 ancient individuals with published genome-wide data had entered the resource by the end of 2022. That means the tools available to researchers today are far more powerful than they were when the Marsh Arab study was published. But there is a major challenge: Iraq and Southern Reports study successfully extracted ancient DNA from the interior of a roughly 2,900-year-old clay brick from Nimrud, revealing plant DNA preserved within the object. That was not human DNA, and it does not solve the Sumerian ancestry question. But it demonstrates something important. Ancient Mesopotamian materials can preserve molecular information in unexpected ways. Imagine what future methods might reveal from human remains, teeth, sediments, or other protected archaeological contexts. The genetic map of Mesopotamia could become far more detailed, and when that happens, we may finally be able to test the Sumerian continuity question at a much higher resolution. We could compare people from different Sumerian cities. We could ask whether Uruk had a different genetic profile from Ur. We could examine whether the population of the southern marshes changed dramatically during the Bronze Age. We could identify migration events. We could distinguish local ancestry from later contributions. We could even investigate whether particular paternal lineages expanded during periods of urban growth. That would transform the story. Because right now, we have clues. We have archaeology. We have modern genetic data. We have population models. But the ancient genomes of the actual people who lived in Sumer remain the missing pieces of the puzzle. And perhaps that missing evidence is exactly why the mystery has survived. Imagine an archaeologist uncovering a burial near an ancient city. The bones belong to a man who lived 4,000 years ago. His teeth contain fragments of DNA. His Y chromosome survives. His genome is compared with modern populations. Suddenly, the question becomes measurable. Did his genetic ancestry cluster with modern southern Iraqis? Did it resemble populations from northern Mesopotamia? Did he have ancestry related to the Iranian plateau? Did his lineage survive in the marshes? Or did his genetic line disappear? One ancient genome would not solve the entire civilization, but hundreds could change everything. This is how ancient DNA works. It is not about finding one magical individual. It is about reconstructing population history from patterns across any individuals and time periods. And the same lesson applies to the modern Marsh Arabs. They should not be described as frozen Sumerians living unchanged for 5,000 years. That would be scientifically and historically misleading. They are a modern population with their own identity, history, and genetic diversity. Their ancestry has been shaped by local continuity, migration, and social structure. The fascinating possibility is that some of their ancestry may descend from ancient populations that also contributed to Sumerian civilization. That is a much more defensible and much more profound idea. It means the end of Sumerian civilization may not have been the end of every Sumerian-descended family. It may have been a cultural transformation. The language disappeared. The political system disappeared. The temples lost their original function. But people continued. They became part of new societies. Their descendants spoke different languages and followed different traditions. Yet pieces of their biological history may have survived. This is how civilizations disappear in human history. They do not always vanish like a light being switched off. Sometimes they dissolve into what comes next. A population survives while its name changes. A language disappears while its speakers' descendants remain. A city becomes ruins while surrounding communities continue. An empire collapses while farmers keep planting crops. History records the collapse. DNA may record the continuity, and that may be the real secret behind the Sumerian bloodline. Not that one magical family survived unchanged for thousands of years, but that the human population of southern Mesopotamia may have carried pieces of its ancient past through enormous cultural transformations. The strongest evidence we currently have is suggestive rather than absolute. The Marsh Arab study found a predominantly Middle Eastern gene pool and identified a J1 page 08 paternal branch with a local expansion estimated around 4,000 years ago, overlapping the Sumerian city-state period. The authors interpreted this as evidence of genetic stratification that could be associated with the development of Sumerian civilization, while still acknowledging uncertainty about the ultimate origins of the Sumerians. That is a much more interesting conclusion than a fake 1 in a billion statistic, because it leaves room for discovery. It tells us that something real is there, but the final story has not yet been written. And perhaps one day the missing evidence will emerge. Maybe ancient DNA from southern Iraq will show substantial continuity between Bronze Age populations and modern marsh communities. Maybe it will reveal several waves of migration that changed the genetic landscape. Maybe it will show that the Sumerian population itself was genetically diverse from the beginning, overturn some of today's interpretations. That is how science is supposed to work. Evidence becomes stronger, models become more precise, old conclusions are tested. Some survive, others disappear. The mystery becomes clearer one piece at a time. But even before that future evidence arrives, there is something extraordinary about the idea that a genetic lineage associated with southern Mesopotamia may have expanded around the same era when humanity's first great city-states were transforming the region. 4,000 years ago, people were living in a world that would be almost impossible for us to recognize. There were no modern nations, no electricity, no satellites, no genetic laboratories. But people still had families. Fathers had sons, mothers had daughters, communities expanded, people moved. Some family lines ended, others survived. And one of those surviving lines may still be detectable today. Somewhere in the chain between an ancient man and a modern descendant, thousands of births occurred. Each generation passed on only part of the previous generation's genetic story. Yet the Y chromosome followed one narrow paternal path, carrying mutations forward through time. The ancient man's name disappeared. His house disappeared. His city changed. His descendants changed their language. But the molecular signature of his paternal line may still exist. That is what makes DNA so powerful. It does not remember history the way humans do. It remembers through inheritance. It does not know that a civilization was called Sumer. It does not know that Uruk was important. It does not know the names of kings. But mutations accumulate, lineages branch, populations expand, and scientists can read those patterns thousands of years later. So did scientists discover a 1 in a billion Sumerian bloodline? Not literally. There is no verified 1 in a billion measurement. But did genetic research uncover a real paternal lineage in modern Marsh Arabs whose expansion appears to overlap the era of Sumerian city-state development? Yes. Did researchers find that the Marsh Arab gene pool is predominantly Middle Eastern rather than showing evidence of wholesale South Asian replacement? Yes. Does that prove every Marsh Arab is descended directly from Sumerians? No. Does it prove that the Sumerians were genetically identical to modern Iraqis? No. Does it prove that the Sumerian mystery is solved? Absolutely not. And that is where the story becomes even more exciting, because the mystery is no longer, did the Sumerians disappear? The better question is, how much of the ancient southern Mesopotamian population survived inside the people who came after them? That question can be tested. Ancient DNA can test it. Modern population genetics can test it. Archaeology can test it. And every new discovery can move us closer to the answer. One day, perhaps researchers will recover enough ancient genomes from Sumerian period sites to reconstruct the population directly. They may find that the people of Ur and Uruk were surprisingly diverse. They may find genetic links to northern Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. They may discover population movements that correspond with archaeological changes. They may even find that the rise of the city-state itself changed the genetic structure of the region through population growth and migration. If that happens, the Marsh Arab story will become even more important because we will finally have ancient genomes with which to compare the modern population. Until then, the responsible conclusion is not that the secret has been completely exposed. The responsible conclusion is that the evidence points toward a deeper story of local continuity and demographic change. And perhaps that is the hidden truth behind the viral title. The Sumerians did not need to remain Sumerian for their biological legacy to survive. Their civilization could disappear while their descendants continued. Their language could become extinct while their genes remained. Their political identity could be replaced while their families became part of new populations. That is how human history works. We are not separate from the people who lived thousands of years before us. We are the result of their survival, their movement, their marriages, their migrations, their catastrophes, and their choices. Every modern population is a living archive of ancient events. And in the marshes of southern Iraq, one of those archives may contain a particularly fascinating chapter, a chapter that reaches back toward the era when Uruk grew into a massive city, when clay tablets began recording the details of everyday life, when temples dominated the landscape, and when the foundations of urban civilization were being built. The people who lived there could never have imagined that thousands of years later, scientists would examine their descendants' DNA and ask whether traces of their ancient world were still alive. Yet that is exactly what is happening. The answer is not a simple yes or no. It is a pattern, a signal, a genetic clue, a branch on a family tree that may have expanded during the same broad era as the rise of Sumerian city-states. It is not proof of a mythical pure bloodline. It is something more realistic and, in a way, more extraordinary, evidence that human populations can carry fragments of their ancient history across enormous stretches of time. So the next time you hear the words, 1 in a billion Sumerian bloodline, remember that the real story is not about a magical number. It is about a lineage, a landscape, and a civilization whose human legacy may have survived in ways that archaeology alone could never reveal. The ruins of Sumer tell us where the civilization stood. The tablets tell us what some of its people wrote. The rivers tell us why they settled there. And DNA may eventually tell us what happened to the people after the civilization changed. We are still missing pieces. But the pieces we have are enough to ask a question that would have sounded impossible a century ago. When the last great Sumerian city-states disappeared, did their people disappear too, or did they simply beings leave traces behind? Sometimes those traces are written on clay, sometimes they are buried beneath ruins, and sometimes, hidden inside the DNA of people alive today, they are still waiting to be read.